Thank you for choosing to attend the AACN 2021 Student Series programming. I'm Dr. Leslie Guadati-Bredding, and I'm chair of the AACN Student Affairs Committee. I'm excited to introduce to you the panel that we have today to discuss work-life integration. First up, you will hear from Dr. Darren Kobia, who is an assistant professor of psychology and neuroscience at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. His research interests as a neuropsychologist primarily include using neuroimaging to study how changes in brain structure influence cognition and behavior in psychosis spectrum disorders. After Darren, you will hear from Dr. Andrew Hubner, who is a board-certified pediatric clinical neuropsychologist and assistant professor of psychology at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. She is specialty training director for the Medical Psychology Fellowship Program and co-director of the Neurodevelopmental Disorders Program. She is a member of the American Board of Clinical Neuropsychology. Her primary clinical and research interests include autism biomarkers and phenotypes and late effects of childhood brain tumors. And last, but certainly not least, is Dr. Alyssa Butts, who is a board-certified clinical neuropsychologist and assistant professor of neurology at the Medical College of Wisconsin. Alyssa holds a position of research collaborator with Mayo Clinic as well. I actually had the privilege of teaching Alyssa her very first neuropsychological test while we were in grad school. But currently, back to present time, Dr. Butts is predoctoral neuropsychology practicum co-director at MCW and is heavily involved in the Abson neuropsychology postdoctoral training program there. Her primary clinical and research interests are in neurodegenerative disorders and neuro-oncology populations. I hope you will find this panel discussion to be interesting and bring many questions to our live Q&A during the conference. Thank you.
Hello and welcome. Welcome to workshop number 1 of the annual AACN 2021 conference, Work-Life Integration in Neuropsychology. My name is Dr. Darren Kobia. I'm a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. So today, I'm going to start out this conversation with some discussion of the theory, principles, and ideas behind work-life integration as a neuropsychologist. But before I do that, I wanted to make sure and highlight this publication that I had the great opportunity to be a part of. This is a paper published in 2017 by Dr. Maya Feigun and colleagues in TCN, and much of what I'm going to talk about today is drawn from this paper. So I encourage you to find that and read it if you want some more details, okay? Okay, so let's talk about work-life integration. What's the rationale? Why would you care about integrating the roles that you have at work as well as your own personal life? Well, one is that being able to reconcile the personal needs that you have against your professional identity can be challenging. This is not an easy thing to do. And when they are not properly integrated, it creates some dissonance. And this dissonance can fluctuate over time. It can exacerbate or it can be mild. And that really kind of depends on where you're at in life and in your career. Certainly there are these critical junctures that happen across your career and life stage, such as transitioning from one job to another, getting married, having kids, or preparing for promotion and tenure. All those sorts of experiences can create a peak or exacerbation in your ability to integrate those two roles or your identities contained within those roles. But not only are there periods of time where they are highlighted or stronger, they're also, it can also happen on a day-to-day basis. So things like changes in a family schedule, a kid is sick, you have some strife with the coworker. These things can also create tension or friction between your role as somebody who operates in a work setting and in a setting outside of that, your personal life. Now, but before we kind of get lost in the weeds or the details, I wanted to talk about two concepts, wellness and well-being, because I believe these ideas pertain to this general picture or worldview of how to integrate your work and your life roles. So what do we mean by wellness? Wellness, as defined by the Global Wellness Institute, defines it as the active pursuit of activities, choices, and lifestyles that lead to a state of holistic health. And wellness is not just a single unitary construct. It's actually defined in many different ways from a psychometric perspective, if you will. So there have been different ideas or theories on how to break down this idea or concept of wellness. Most places describe it in terms of 6 dimensions, which include things like physical, environmental, mental, social, spiritual, and emotional. But there are also there's also work that identifies it in 8 to up to anywhere from 8 to 12 different constructs. But overall, the idea here is that wellness is about practicing or engaging in behaviors that create wholeness or health within those various dimensions. And we could spend a whole lecture discussing wellness, but there are some really great resources if you wish to dive further on this topic. I recommend the National Wellness Institute. I have a link here, as well as the Global Wellness Institute. They have some pretty good information, as well as materials and resources that can help you engage in wellness. Now, wellness is different than well-being, and sometimes those two terms are conflated in research, as well as just in society. So well-being is different in that it's more of a state of being, a state of feeling happy, healthy, or prosperous. That's how it's typically defined. In fact, you'll find a lot of the ideas or concepts surrounding well-being a part of the positive psychology literature. So Ed Diner, he describes it in terms of subjective well-being and couches it in terms of happiness, life satisfaction, or positive affect. Martin Seligman, on the other hand, he measures it in terms of this acronym that he uses, PERMA, which stands for positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. So when you're feeling, happy or healthy in those particular dimensions, then you're experiencing well-being. How these two relate is that, and how I like to think about it is, again, well-being is a state of being and a idea, a goal, a pursuit of how I want to be in the world. Whereas wellness is more the active engagement or the practice, the behaviors that are going to lead me to well-being. I like this graphic here. This is from the Global Wellness Institute, where they sort of describe how these two are related and how concepts of wellness can relate or portend to well-being and happiness. So I believe that when we talk about this integration of work and life in as it pertains to our role as neuropsychologists, we're really wanting to practice wellness and eventually be in a state of well-being. And that happens when we're able to successfully integrate those roles. Okay, so this comes from our paper. What we have to first, I think, identify some of the challenges as it currently stands in this field of work-life integration, or kind of understanding how these things work. And the 3 challenges that we identified were, one is that if you look in the literature, there's really no consistent definition of terms. People talk about it in ways of conflict, so work-life conflict, where these things are at odds with each other. They talk about it in terms of work-life balance, as if it's something that needs to be evenly distributed. And even in the literature, what they mean by work and life, these things have different meanings to different people depending on who you are. So that's one of the challenges. A second challenge is this lack of translating the research findings to very practical recommendations. There seems to be this disconnect between understanding what's happening or what's going on with individuals, institutions, communities, versus how do you fix it. And that's something that has been, that we identified that has been not as well fleshed out. And then finally, It's really important to highlight that there are limits with regard to the application of the literature to people of different genders, race, professional fields, stages of development, so on and so forth. So issues surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion are, certainly there are limitations as it pertains to those areas. What we find is that most of the literature is focused on Caucasian females who are early stage professionals, and most of it is not related to psychology at all. In fact, it's mostly business and medicine. So those are some of the limitations. Okay, let's define our terms, the nomenclature that we're going to use. What do we mean by life? Well, life is, in a sense, you could define it as a construct of exclusion. So it's anything that's not work related. So these are things that are personal to you. So your personal circumstances, your family circumstances, health, finances. That's what we typically mean when we talk about life. Work is basically everything related to your job, what you do to earn money and to engage in a professional career. Previous models, as I mentioned before, typically talk about this in terms of work-life conflict, work-life balance. And the more you study those terms or those ideas, the more it becomes clear that they're not quite accurate, or they're not useful, because conflict, again, talks about in terms that they're fighting against one another. There's some battle there, and one's got to win out while one has to lose. The balance part connotates this kind of mentality of equilibrium, that everything has to be perfectly balanced. And that's not really true either. If you think about your roles, whether it's in work or in life, one is always going to be higher balance than the other, or the scales are going to be tipped in one direction more versus the other. So you can never have complete balance. And this quest for achieving complete balance between these two roles is really, I would say, idealistic and impractical. So what I think are more appropriate definitions would be, again, this term of work-life integration. How do you integrate or bring these two roles together in a way that promotes wellness and well-being? Another term that I've heard used that also some people think is helpful is personal professional integration, where it's the integration of your personal and your professional identities. So these types of terms, or these constructs, if you will, I think are more helpful when framing this issue of resolving the apparent discord that can happen between those two roles. Now, this table is from our paper. It's adapted from these two authors, Ashforth and Clark, and it has to do with the way in which someone can be integrated or segmented within these particular roles. What you have here is your basic Punnett square, if you will, and on these dimensions are, on one side, flexibility, and the other permeability. And what we mean by flexibility is your ability to shift your boundaries, whether spatially or temporally, to meet the demands of one domain or the other. So how flexible are you to accommodate the needs of your professional life or your work life versus your personal life? Permeability is the level of intrusion or interference that one domain has from another. So how permeable are those boundaries between work and life? Does one bleed into the other, if you will? And what you can see here in this Punnett square is that, for example, one can be in a situation where they are highly flexible, and their work-life roles, or the permeability of their work-life roles, is also high. And what that relates to is a very, what could be termed an integrative way to engage those two different roles. So you may have, the level of intrusion from work and from life may bleed into each other, pretty highly, but your ability to be flexible to accommodate that may be high as well. And what that, again, can result in is this high integration of those two different roles. On the flip side, you could have, for example, something that's termed segmentation, where the boundaries are pretty fixed between your identity and roles in work and life, yet your ability to accommodate or be flexible to operate within that is also low. So you have this very segmented where I'm at work and I only operate in work and I only do what I do at work and work stays at work, versus in relation to home. So my roles at home stay at home. They don't interfere with each other. I can't be very adaptive or flexible to accommodate those things. So it's good that they're very structured and segmented. And there's also a different, there's different interactions. There's different interactions, or there's different ways in which that can also look as well. So you could have high flexibility and low permeability, which relates to autonomy. You can also have low flexibility, where you're rather inflexible in your ability to accommodate a highly integrative or permeable work-life role. So the desirability of one versus the other could potentially be viewed as a function of personal preference. However, there's been studies out there that have shown that work-life segmentation, so that little bottom left corner there, is related to some pretty adverse outcomes, such as decreased life satisfaction and job satisfaction, and negative impact on family, exacerbated and increased, physical and mental health problems, reduced productivity, so on and so forth. Whereas the literature in this high section of the square, so the high integration, shows just the opposite. So increased job satisfaction and positive impact on the family and more positive outcomes. So that's something to be aware of. Now, it's important to highlight that your ability to integrate your work-life demands and roles can vary as a function of where you are in your career phase. I've broken these up into three kind of general categories. The first one is what I would consider the training category. Even though the expectations and demands do differ between graduate school, internship, and postdoc, in essence, the kind of things that you're going to face and be trying to reconcile or integrate are generally the same. And what you have here is you're really kind of beginning to, for the first time, experience that career-related stress, right? All the stresses in grad school, I'm sorry to say, are not going to go away once you get your job and move on throughout your career. You're going to have to learn to adapt to those, and stresses won't leave. And learning how to adapt to those is a really important skill that I think is best learned early on, in particular in graduate school. And here at this phase, you also have an opportunity, if you haven't yet, to identify the most meaningful components of your personal life and to use them as a counterweight to the work roles or demands that you have. For example, I have a couple of graduate students who have joined a bowling league to relieve stress and to become integrated with the community. That's something that's kind of unique to them that they like to engage in to help balance or counteract some of the stresses related to graduate school. And I think it's really important to establish some of these habits early on, that you create a schedule, that you organize these things, that you be intentful with this particular way of relating between these two roles. And I think it's also helpful to create or to engage other people that can become potential stakeholders in this, such as peers, your cohort in graduate school, as well as your mentor. Now, transitioning from the training phase to the early career stage presents itself with its own unique challenges. It's at this stage that you're starting to develop a professional identity. You want to develop increased competence in what area or aspect of neuropsychology you want to practice in. For example, board certification is something that would be on most individuals' minds. And in the life realm, you're beginning, probably getting married, starting a family. You could be relocating to a different state or different city, perhaps buying a home. All of these situations create a different type of way or dynamic in which you're going to interact or integrate your particular work-life roles. And then mid-career and beyond. So mid-career, this is where you start really establishing yourself as a professional, identifying your areas of expertise, where you're taking on increased leadership roles and responsibilities, perhaps locally or maybe more broadly in societies and organizations. You're also experiencing new things like, your children are getting older. You may have aging parents. There could be changes in relationship status, death, divorce. These sorts of things start to occur as you progress from, mid-career to even late stage or late career stages and beyond. What we know is that some of the literature suggests that this is the kind of career stage that relates to the highest degree of burnout. That changes actually when people get into late stages. They report more satisfaction, they report working fewer hours, they report less stress with life roles or responsibilities because kids have grown up, moved on, and so on and so forth. Now, not only career stage, but also your work setting can have an impact on how you uniquely address or identify some of these challenges for integrating your work-life roles. The three main ones that we find ourselves in as neuropsychologists are first, a hospital or an academic medicine clinical setting. This is probably the most common. And some of the challenges there have to do with clinical productivity, right? Hospitals want to bill and they want to, generate revenue and they want to keep the lights on. And, you are certainly a part of that machine. And, what this, for most institutions, means is that you have to be familiar with RVU demands and those clinical targets. You have to navigate the CPT system and know what codes to bill for and what are most appropriate and all the complexities involved in that particular system. In addition, many of these institutions require additional research or educational goals. They have an expectation that you engage in some little extras, right? In order to be a fully functioning member or to be eligible for merit increases or other advances in rank and status. People tend to like hospital settings because of the job security. It's very clear on how much you're going to get paid, how pay increases work, you get medical benefits, retirement. There are things that you can count on when you have a job at an institution like this. What they found in the literature, though, is that typically the job satisfaction in these settings is somewhat lower relative to academia and private practice. And that probably has to do with some of the stresses that come with operating within those institutions. Now, in academia or the university setting, what we see is that the main goal or the main work responsibility for neuropsychologists at the university is to teach and to do research. And that provides a fair degree of flexibility, which can be a double-edged sword. Some people like being able to determine their own schedule. I teach on these days, I'm in the lab these days, and that's really nice. For others, it could be a challenge. They like the structure. They want to have boundaries and limits placed in place so that they can, function well. And the stresses that come from working in academia usually are infrequent and they're variable. It happens when you're going up for promotion or tenure, or when there are certain deadlines due for projects, or working with collaborators or other individuals. So, those are some of the challenges related to working in academics. Now, again, some people like this flexibility in schedule, and because it relates to a greater, in their minds, life satisfaction. But again, if too much liberty is taken with that flexibility in schedule, individuals will find themselves behind on research productivity and other markers or indices of growth that universities want to see in order to advance in rank. Okay, and finally is private practice. So private practice is pretty appealing to neuropsychologists because of the perceived autonomy and flexibility. They can set their own schedule. And again, they can kind of do things on their own terms is how it's usually positioned. People in private practice usually report greater happiness and perceived accomplishment in the literature. And this is despite work hours may be somewhat inconsistent. Sometimes they have to be flexible depending on who they're seeing or the population of patients. It may require writing and billing at home. It may require, some, flexibility in or not flexibility, but it really requires some degree of financial resources. You're going to probably have to take out a business loan, and there's some risk associated with that. And that could be challenging or stressful because the income stream is usually a bit more variable in private practice. You get paid depending on when your patients pay you or their insurance pays you, as opposed to getting a monthly paycheck at, say, a hospital or a university. So these are some of the unique challenges associated with work settings. But I would say above all, it's important to, wherever you're at, to be an advocate and to be engaged in promoting a healthy workplace. Even if it's your own private practice, I think it's important to be an advocate for these concepts of wellness and well-being and properly integrating work-life roles. Okay, so before I finish up, I wanted to just kind of emphasize a broader concept or bigger picture that we could likely discuss later on in the question and answer panel. But what I really would want you to start thinking about is knowing what you want. And knowing what you want is really going to help you identify some of the potential challenges you're going to be up against or currently up against, but also help establish this mindset, this meaning frame, if you will, for tackling the difficulties that come with integrating work-life roles. So what I want you to do is first identify what matters most to you. And this is going to require you to engage in some self-reflection, okay? You're going to have to kind of sit there. You're going to take a long walk on the beach or up the mountains or whatever it takes for you to kind of think about, what matters most to you? What are your values? What are your interests? What kind of grand vision do you have for yourself? Don't be afraid to get a little existential, all right? How do I fit in this world? How do I want to relate to others, to family, to friends, to my community? How do I want to engage in the world in a positive and in a meaningful and impactful way? How do I want to help people, whether it's in my personal life or at work? Because I think we're in this discipline because we want to help others. And once you've done that, or at least gotten to a point where you feel comfortable with where you're at in those values and interests, is then to create a plan, establish a plan and attach goals to it that help you accomplish these things, that help act out, if you will, to engage in these values and interests. How are you going to do that? What kind of plan are you going to have? What are your goals that you're going to have that will help you do this? And I would say start broad and then get more narrow, if you will. Think about, okay, what kind of population do I want to work with? Do I want to have a family? What kind of family do I want to have? Do I want to live close to extended relatives? Do I want to be in different cities, different states? Do I want to, engage in these particular interests or hobbies? All those sorts of things will play into how successful you are in being able to deal with or integrate these issues. And I would say make sure and make this a living document, okay? This is something that should be flexible and adaptive, not rigid, so that it changes as a function of time and stage of career development, because the future is always uncertain and things change. So whatever you do, I would say also consider that you are choosing the personal and family lifestyles or opportunities that best support wellness, that will make you an individual who can engage in wellness and that can function from a position of well-being, okay? So know what circumstances work best for you in your situation. For some people, this is not an easy thing to do, to kind of get existential and to kind of self-reflect. And for those who are interested, there's a great resource that I recommend. It's a book by Bohal and colleagues called The Psychologist's Guide to Professional Development. And what you'll find is chapter 2 is focused specifically on kind of the development of self. And it has some really great exercises, ideas, and things that you can, these kind of resources that you can use to get you on your way to that. And that's published by Springer. Okay, my final slide. This final slide is just kind of my Zen slide, my slide to create harmony and instill peace and tranquility within each and every one of you as you start considering these topics. And I think it's good to consider these things now versus later, so that there is less distress, less segmentation, less burden upon you as you try and find, again, harmony between your work identity and your personal identity, that you can have those things integrate in a healthy way. So I hope these concepts and ideas were helpful as an introduction, and I look forward to discussing them more in our question and answer panel. All right, see you then. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Dr. Andrea Huebner, and I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. I am going to be doing the third of 3 sections of the student workshop series on work-life integration. What I'd like to do in our time together is to bring some of the concepts that Drs. Butts and Kobia have presented earlier regarding the literature on work-life integration, and really use this to apply it to your thinking when you are taking that first step out of fellowship and thinking about the next phase of your life. So what I'd like to cover in our time together is to present a little bit of information on what the research says about job satisfaction. We're going to steal some concepts from the business world and apply them to neuropsychology, and use them to think about what things we need to be considering for the next steps in your career. We will also talk about the dangers of being a high achiever and how that could unintentionally sabotage you moving forward. We will also take a hard look at your own resource allocation to see how well it aligns with the things that you say are important to you. And then lastly, I will share some tips that I've learned with you about work-life integration. I am a mid-career person. I've been out of fellowship for 15 years. I'm on my 2nd position. I'm a wife, I have 2 kids, and I've been grateful to have mentors and colleagues that have shared some tips with me along the way that I've found helpful, and I hope you'll find them helpful too. So let's get started. Okay, so just a little bit of terminology here. I know you've been through a lot of this already, but I'll start by admitting something to you that I don't like to bring to people's attention, but I think this will help us to understand this point. I chose my first job out of fellowship based almost entirely on salary. And I know what you're thinking. She's a really shallow person. I can't refute that over video, but I will say that what was in my mind at the time is that I had gotten some help during undergraduate and graduate school, but I certainly had school debt, like many of us do coming out of our training programs. I also was very aware that I had missed out on some important early years of my career. And so I wasn't banking money or making a house payment or contributing to my 401 like some of my friends were. And so I really feel like I needed to make up for some lost time. So Frederick Herzberg has a 2-factor theory on job satisfaction. And I think if I had known anything about his theory at the time that I was making my decision about which offer to accept from the few that I had, I may have made a different decision. So what are the factors? There are what Herzberg would call hygiene factors that relate to job satisfaction and motivation factors. So I was almost entirely focused on hygiene factors, and it's easy to get over-focused on this aspect of job satisfaction because I think it's maybe the easiest things for us to see from the outset. When you're not part of an organization, things like what's the compensation going to look like? What kind of bonuses might I be eligible for? What are the benefits? What is my office space? Am I going to have a window? Who am I going to be working with? What's my supervisor like? How many patients do I have to see a week? These are things that you can get answers to during your job interview, or you at least have the opportunity to make some observations that can help you understand some of these pieces. So these things are important because when you come out of training, you might have a goal to buy a house, or you might want to travel. And so you certainly do need to have a salary that is going to help support some of your personal goals. However, Herzberg would say that we also need to be considering what are called motivation factors. And these are the things that I think I didn't have in mind whatsoever when I was making this decision. Or if I did, I was just clouded by the hygiene factors and they just fell too far down on my list. So motivating factors are also hard to understand because they're less tangible and they're harder to evaluate from the outside of an organization. But Herzberg would say that these factors are just as important as hygiene factors in terms of job satisfaction. So, am I going to have the opportunity to do challenging work that is meaningful to me? Am I going to be able to work with a population I love? Are there opportunities for me to rise in this organization, to be recognized for my talents, and to be promoted for good work that I do? Now, Herzberg would say that both of these aspects of job satisfaction are important. So what I'd like for you to do is to think about how these things need to balance for you. What the theory says, and which I found to be true, I have to say, is that no matter how much money you're getting paid, no matter how nice your office is, if that is not balanced with other things that are meaningful in terms of job satisfaction, such as being recognized for your good work, being able to do things that are challenging for you, then no amount of salary is going to help you be truly satisfied with that job. Another thing that I'd like to share with you is some thoughts on resource allocation. So you have finished your fellowship, you have decided on that first job, you've thought about Herzberg's two-factor theory, and you feel like you've made a decision that helps you balance both the hygiene factors and the motivation factors. Now, this is a really important next step. What is your strategy for your first position out of fellowship? One of the things that was a very pleasant surprise to me when I was an early career person is I had developed a skill set that people seemed to want access to. When you are in that first position, you are going to find that there are constant demands for your resources, your time, your talent, your energy. So how do you decide where those resources go? Because there's only so much of you. Is it whoever bugs you the most, whoever sends the most emails? Is it whatever offers the quickest reward? Is it the opportunity that you receive on a day that you happen to be in a good mood? Real strategy for that first position out of fellowship is created through hundreds of decisions that you make during the week about where you spend your resources. Let me put it this way. If you find yourself with an extra 30 minutes at home, what do you do? Do you check your work email? Do you try to finish off that report and get the bill in? Or do you go for a walk? Do you talk with your partner about their day? Do you get down on the floor and play with your kids? It's important to watch where your resources flow. If they're not supporting the strategy that you've decided upon, then you're not implementing a strategy at all. So it's important to be mindful about these are the things that I've said are important to me, and my resources then follow. Let me put it another way. I would venture to say that most all of you are high achievers. You, at some point in your upbringing, were reinforced, heavily rewarded for achieving, for being smart, for accomplishing things, and that felt good to you. And that is one thing that has driven you to all of these years of training. Most people don't stick with it this long. So there's something about you, and there's something about that payoff of achieving that is important for you. It's not a bad thing. But as high achievers, we're also at risk for making bad decisions. So let me tell you why. Here's a little moment of truth for you. I'd like you to take 10, 15 seconds and just kind of quickly list in your head your priorities. What are your priorities? What are your values? What's important to you? Is it your hobbies? Is it your family? Is it your spouse, your kids, your job? I'll stop talking so you can think briefly and just kind of come up with a numerical order in your mind, maybe 1 to 5. All right, so here's where the rubber hits the road. Now I want you to think about your calendar for the last month. What's on it? Is it jam-packed with work stuff? Do you have any white space in there that you've left for time to call an old friend or go see your parents? Date night with your partner? How many times have you actually sat down and played a board game with your kids? If you listed your priorities as it's family, it's my relationships, it's my friendships, it's my faith, it's my hobbies, but you have a calendar that is 95% full of work, then the strategy that you are implementing is not at all in line with what you say are your priorities. And the consequence of this isn't going to come probably for a while, but if this is the pattern that you set up, and if this continues for a few years, maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years, you're going to end up with something down the line that's very different than what you intended. So, high achievers, why does this happen? You know, most people wouldn't say that their priority is to please their boss over pleasing their spouse, or to get a raise over developing a strong relationship with their child. And yet, that's what sometimes happens in these situations where people are focused on the immediate returns of the payoff that we can get from succeeding at work. It's easier for us to invest every little bit of time and energy in whatever activity yields the clearest, most immediate evidence that we've achieved something. So things that we might do at work, like writing a report, dropping a bill, being able to finish a presentation, submitting a poster or paper, these are things that have a clear beginning and an end. Some of them have a longer timeline than others. But those things feel good to us because we get reinforced for them. We can say we did something. We can check it off the list. Conversely, let's think about some things that we might say are important in our personal life. Maintaining friendships, keeping up a good relationship with our spouse or partner, helping our children grow to be decent citizens and human beings. How about our faith? It can be very difficult to invest our resources in some of these personal arenas when we're not going to see the payoff for them for a really long time. How long does it take to be able to say, I raised a good kid? 2 decades? I mean, even then, they might be living in your basement, so the jury's still out. The problem is, with many of the things that we say are important to us, many aspects of our personal lives, we don't see a return on that investment for a long time. And so people who are high achievers, smart, ambitious people like yourselves, it is easy to get in a pattern where you're prioritizing work, especially when you're getting constant pressure from work to give work your time and attention. Conversely, with our personal relationships, you can neglect those for quite a while, and it might seem like there's no consequence to that. You know, in fact, many of you probably have partners or parents who have been willing to take a back seat, maybe for several years, while you pursued your training and your dreams. They're used to you saying, can't come to the birthday party. I'm sorry that, you know, I forgot to send you a card for your anniversary, whatever. They have been willing to overlook those things because they love you. They want you to be successful. And chances are, since they're in that pattern along with you, it might be quite a while before some of these things become a problem. But that's the thing. If you don't invest in your relationships and in your personal life now, when it finally does become a problem and rise to your attention, it may be too late. Okay, that seemed like kind of a downer, and I didn't mean for it to be. I just trying to convey that it's important to have forethought about these things, because many of you are in the perfect position to do a pivot. I don't like that word. It's been overused in 2021, but I guess it fits in this case. You've been in student and trainee mode. You've been making lots of sacrifices for your future. And now you're standing on the precipice of this wonderful career, and you can build it. You can create it to be what you want it to be. It's the perfect time to engage your frontal lobes and make a shift in some of the things that you've been doing, the routines that you've had going for years of your education, and think about, I get to create something new now, and what do I want that to look like? And the key is to be intentional about it. Okay, so now I'll share some lessons that I've learned with you. This is kind of the last part of my talk. So these, some of these are based in literature, but many of them are just things that I've learned and things people have told me that I have found to be helpful. Number one, you will never be done, ever. You won't. I can't tell you how many times I have thought to myself, I'm going to take that vacation as soon as I get that grant in, or I'll volunteer at my kid's school as soon as I get the paper written. I don't have time to start a garden right now, but as soon as I get more on top of my reports, that's going to be my priority. This is a fallacy, because there will always be more for you to do at work. And in fact, the kind of ironic thing is that the better you are at your job, the more opportunities will come your way. Which leads me to my second point. You are the only person who will put boundaries around your work. Your supervisor is never going to come to you and say, hey, I noticed that you turned out 3 papers last year. Are you sure you're taking enough time with your family? Are you getting enough sleep? I'm worried that, you know, you're eating at your desk a lot and your diet isn't so good. No one is going to say this. And in fact, it'll be the opposite, because you'll be getting recognition for doing all of these work things that's probably going to feed you and fuel you to continue in that pattern. This is really dangerous because, again, if you think back to being high achievers, this feels good to us. So you are the only person who is going to be able to look at your calendar and draw those lines. There have been many nights that it was time to go home, but I have thought, just this one more thing, it'll put me in a better position for tomorrow morning. And I've stayed and done it. The consequence of that is there's stuff going on at home with my kids that I'll never get back. There will always be another report. There will always be another patient to add to my schedule. But my kids are only going to be 4 once. And I'm sharing this with you because I've learned some of these things the hard way. Another thing that I found helpful is paying attention to the things that I procrastinate on. This is yourself trying to tell you something important. I know for myself, it's really easy for me to crank out reports. I've been doing it long enough. I've got my templates set. Many patients that I see kind of fall into predictable patterns. And so that doesn't take a lot of mental work or thinking for me. On the other hand, the things that are hard for me and require much more mental effort are things like writing a manuscript, anything that has a creative component, developing materials for our training program, working on program development with other areas. Starting with a blank sheet of paper and having to create something is like a really hard thing for me. And what I find is that for those kinds of tasks, they continue to fall down on my to-do list. I find lots of reasons not to do them. So it wasn't until a few years ago that I finally started using this information to help me make my decisions about what I say yes to. And I think Dr. Butts talked about that a little bit. You are going to have a lot of opportunities. It's wonderful. There's so many things that you're going to be able to do with your clinical work, with your research programs, with education and training. You can't do it all, and that's okay. So pay attention to the things that you are willing to do first. And for the things that really seem like burdens, like monkeys on your back, that's a clue. And that's something that can help you make your decisions in the future. Another thing that I've found helpful is I schedule days off very far in advance, just kind of peppered into my calendar. 2 months, I've got a Friday off. 3 months from now, I'm taking an extra Monday off. The problem with, or one of the challenges of the work that we do is that you'll probably be like this too if you work, especially at an academic medical institution, but really anytime you're in patient care, once a patient gets put on your schedule, man, you're stuck. And sometimes you have to know 6 months ahead of time when you're gonna wanna do something. So by the time 6 months rolls around and you really need a day off, you really just need, you know, a 2 or 3 day vacation, you can't take it because there's patients there to be seen. So proactively block some time in your calendar. Depending on your institution's policies, maybe there would be an issue with this, but personally, if I get close to that time frame and I feel like, nope, I'm good, I don't want to burn this vacation day, I just give it back. But it's just like my little safety net. And sometimes when things get really busy and crazy, being able to look ahead in the calendar and see 2 weeks from now, I'm going to have a Monday to myself can make all the difference. Pro tips, 2 more slides, I think. So these are things that I have learned that have helped with my efficiency. I detest email. It is a time suck. And I can spin my wheels in my inbox for half a day and feel really drained and also have nothing to show for it. Remember that thing, like the short-term versus longer-term rewards? Email is just sort of this endless pit. It's stuff you have to do, stuff you have to respond to, but it doesn't really give you credit in any way. So I have moved to a plan where I check my email twice a day. I check it in the morning when I first get in, and then when I'm doing other things, when I'm seeing patients, when I'm writing, when I'm doing supervision, whatever it may be, I close it out, I turn it off. And then I may check my email again before I leave the office in the evening, but sometimes I don't. Now, the risk of this is people might think, wow, she's really unresponsive. And I'm sure that that's been said, but I just know that for myself, again, this is where you have to put boundaries around things for yourself because no one else will. that I've got lots of other demands on my time, so I can't burn, a whole day or even half a day in email anymore. If the idea of this really bothers you, I know of a colleague who checks his email in the morning and then he puts an out of office message that says something like, I've checked my email for the day. I won't check it again until tomorrow morning. If you need something immediately, please page me. And he never gets paged. So if it makes you feel better to just let people know you're not being a slacker, but this is just how you've planned it, you can always think of doing something like this. Another thing that's really helped me is to have a system where I can capture things that just pop into my mind that need to be on my to-do list no matter where I am. When I'm at work, I think of things that need to be done at home. When I'm at home, I think of things that need to be done at work. And if I don't have some way of capturing those things, it's a mental burden, like a working memory burden, like, oh, I need to remember. Am I going to remember? So what I do is I just usually, it's my phone, I hate to say, but I've almost always got it with me. I just dictate an email to myself to, do send it, and then I can release the pressure of having to remember it or, feeling like I might forget. Another thing that's helpful to me is the 2-minute rule. And this I borrowed from a business seminar that I went to a few years ago called Getting Things Done. And the recommendation is anything that you can do and get done in 2 minutes, do right now. If you can make a phone call in 2 minutes and check that off your list, do it. If you can respond to an email, rattle off a response and be done with it, then do it. Don't add anything that's going to take 2 or 3 minutes to your to-do list. Just get it done. Again, it's the idea of kind of relieving that mental burden. Another thing that I would encourage you to do is to consider what things you can delegate or outsource. This depends a lot on the work setting that you end up in, but often there are administrative support staff that are available to you. You might have psychometricians that can help with database management. Look around you to see who is in your work area that might be able to take on some of the tasks that require a certain level of knowledge or skill, but don't necessarily require that level of skill of a neuropsychologist. Ooh, this is one of my favorite ones, the good enough rule. Since I'm mid-career, I feel comfortable sharing this now, but I probably wouldn't have 10 years ago. The good enough rule is doing work that's good enough. I'll give you an example. I can write a beautiful neuropsych report in 4 hours. I'm a PEDS person, so it takes longer. It'll have no errors. It'll have a beautiful conceptualization that's fully fleshed out and explained. It'll have the test results tied back to neuroanatomy. It'll have detailed, specific recommendations for next steps for that family. I know I'm capable of doing really good work. However, I also know that if I take 4 hours to write a report, then that means I'm either going to have to stay at work late and miss my kid's soccer game, or I'm going to leave work and go to my kid's soccer game, and then I'm going to be at the kitchen table at midnight and 1 o'clock doing the stuff that I needed to get done at work that day. And for a lot of years, I just did it. I mean, I just did this. We all do this, and I still do it sometimes. But what I try to do instead is to do work that I'm proud of that's good enough, to write a report that serves the purpose and helps that patient get to the next step of their care or treatment or whatever it is. But I don't have to edit it 3 times to make sure the wording is just so. It doesn't need to be perfect. Same thing with my feedbacks. I have done feedbacks earlier in my career that were like an hour and a half long. So it was like a feedback plus a therapy session. And there was a part of me that was reinforced by that because it feels good to help people. And when you spend a long time with the family, generally they're appreciative. And so you get that feedback from them too. But I started to wonder if, an hour and a half was really any better than 45 minutes. And how much better was it? Was it worth it to spend that extra time knowing that that was going to have a negative consequence for me personally later? Now, I'm not talking about doing shoddy work. None of us are. We all want to do a good job with our patients, but I'm talking about what do you need to get to feel that you're doing good work and you're doing a good job with your patients, but you're not sacrificing your own well-being in the process. Last slide. Do you have more money than time or time than money? Earlier in my career, I was very poor and I didn't really have a lot of time either, but I also didn't have the money. And not that I have a ton of money now, but I have been able to make decisions about how I spend my personal time. My husband is a clean freak, probably diagnosable, although I've never gotten him in for an appointment. We used to spend a big chunk of our Saturdays with him cleaning the house. And it didn't really bother me so much because I wasn't doing it, but it did prevent us from getting out of the house and doing things as a family with our kids. So I decided that at this point in our lives, we have more money than time together. And so we hired a cleaning person to come in so that he doesn't spend 4 hours doing this on a Saturday, eating up all of our family time. You might have things like this in your life too. If there are, fix-it projects, things that need to be done around your house or other things that need repair. If you like to tinker with those sorts of things, great, do it. But if it's going to mean that you're going to miss out on other things that are actually more important to you, think back to your list of priorities again, you might want to think about outsourcing that. Last couple of things. This seems silly, but ever since I started doing it, I would never change it. I don't work on my birthday, ever. My birthday is in February. It's not a pleasant time of year, usually, in Minnesota, but I look forward to my birthday every year. I also don't work on my kids' birthdays. I've done that before, and there is nothing sadder than going to pick your kid up from daycare on their birthday, knowing that you've got 3 hours left until you're going to put them to bed. So these are hard stops in my schedule. I plan them far in advance. Just there's no negotiating on that one. Lastly, this seems kind of silly, but the older I get, the easier it is to do this, and also the more important it feels. Practicing self-compassion. You all are hard workers. You have sacrificed for years, but you're not perfect. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to say the wrong thing in a meeting. You're going to blurt out something with a patient where you're trying to be helpful, but it comes out the wrong way, and then rapport is going to be jeopardized, and you're just going to have days like that. I tell my kids, we are all just doing the best we can with what we've got at the time. And I think I've said that to them enough times now that I truly believe it myself. So do your best and the rest will follow. Lastly, thank you very much for listening to me and the rest of our panel talk about work-life integration. I want to invite you to join us for the live panel discussion, which will take place on Wednesday, June 9th from 10:30 to 11:30 a.m. Central Standard Time. Take care.
Hi, my name is Alyssa Butts, and I am a neuropsychologist at the Medical College of Wisconsin. Thank you for joining our student workshop series this year as we kind of walk through different aspects of work-life integration. My portion here is going to kind of be focused in two areas. So the first area here, we wanted to give a little bit of time to talking about some of the unique factors, potentially unique factors of personal care and wellness during the pandemic. That we know that work-life integration is an important kind of aspirational goal for all of us at any point in our career and training. But we know that over this last year, there's been some unique challenges. And so I'm going to present to you some data from a couple of surveys that we've completed now with the Student Affairs Committee of the AACN of neuropsychology trainees and the impact that the pandemic has had on them. And then for the second part, I'll share with you a couple of tips and strategies that you may consider integrating not only into kind of your current level of training, but also with a kind of a twist toward or an eye toward some factors that might be somewhat beneficial in kind of an early career stage. So the Student Affairs Committee at the beginning of the pandemic surveyed neuropsychology trainees across different training levels. And we had the survey open for 1 week in April and got a pretty overwhelming response. And so the goal here with this survey was to really try to better understand some of the ways in which the pandemic was impacting neuropsych trainees. And so we sampled several different domains of training, whether it's academic impact or clinical impact, research. Today, I'm just going to share a subset of data from the kind of domain of wellness and personal factors that we asked about. So if you're interested to learn more about these results and explore some of the other content areas that we asked about, I'd encourage you to read this paper here. And I'm also going to show some comparison data for a follow-up survey that we are currently preparing. And this survey was open for a longer period of time through the end of 2020 into the beginning of 2021, so that we could see, about 9 months in, how have things changed, maybe offer some updated recommendations and that sort of thing. So this is a subset of demographics, and we've kind of broken it down here by the initial 2020 survey and then the follow-up survey, which just for kind of ease, I'm going to label 2021 from here on out. And so you can see that the vast majority of people who completed this survey were female in both samples. There were more students that completed the survey in the first survey than compared to the second, but by and large, these demographic factors are pretty similar in terms of kind of their ratios and percentages. So more females than other gender identification, more Caucasian trainees in both samples compared to other racial ethnic groups, and a greater representation of graduate students across both samples studied here, followed by postdocs and then interns. You'll notice that for the second survey, we included an additional training level here. So this early career group was defined as early career neuropsychologists who were within the first 6 months of finishing their postdoc, because we wanted to capture this kind of unique set of trainees who were finishing up their training as the pandemic set in. And so we had kind of a subset of questions that we asked to this kind of unique group. So I'm going to present to you a few different figures here to really kind of highlight some of the personal care factors across the training levels here. And so for this particular figure, we have 3 different variables that I'm showing this was collapsed from 5. And so the disagree group includes people who responded disagree and strongly disagree. And the agree variable includes agree and strongly agree, but we collapsed it down to 3 just to kind of aid in digesting the data. So you can see that for this kind of first and foremost variable that I wanted to share, a question that we asked the trainees, that both in the 2020 and 2021 samples, a high number of trainees are agreeing that they've had increased difficulty balancing work and personal life. And so I think that the content and the theme of this panel is timely in that regard, because it's been a particularly difficult year with all the factors associated with the pandemic. And so if you're an individual that has experienced increased difficulty balancing work and life and integrating work and life, you're certainly not alone. Similarly, across both samples, we see a high number of individuals that have experienced increased anxiety and increased sadness or depression. And then just kind of broadly asking overall, how's your stress level been? A very high number of individuals agreed that the overall stress level has worsened since the pandemic. So then we wanted to ask, well, where are these, what are some of the sources of stress? What are some of the factors playing a role here? And so these are 5 different domains of possible sources of stress that we asked about. And you can see that within the personal health and safety, that a large number of individuals had stress related to their own personal health and safety. And similarly, if we jump over to the right-hand panel, kind of right side of the figure, there's also a lot of stress and potentially worry related to families' health and safety. Not probably surprising, right? There is a slightly kind of a larger number here endorsing this question in the follow-up survey, suggesting this is an ongoing issue for many of us. In the first sample, kind of at the initial stages of the pandemic, more students were worried about their delays to their academic progress than were endorsed in the follow-up survey. I think that's a good thing that some of those kind of worries, concerns, and stresses have quelled a little bit. Similarly, financial stress, although it continues to be a higher number than we would like to see, it at least is kind of stabilized to maybe improved a little bit. And then in looking at considering individuals with children, so these are only people who have endorsed having children, endorsed having a great deal of stress associated with childcare. We then wanted to learn a little bit more about what strategies students may be using to help manage the stress. And these are data just from the 2021 survey. You can reference our original paper for information about strategies that were ongoing and strategies that were new at the start of the pandemic. Here, it's just the 2021 data. And so that you can see here that kind of isolate the top 5, kind of break out pretty cleanly here, that the most frequently endorsed kind of activity is engaging in digital forms of communicating with friends and family, followed by watching television and exercise, podcasts, reading, and that sort of thing. There was a relatively high number of individuals endorsing drinking more and some using more marijuana. Others are reporting eating and sleeping more. And so, it's important to keep an eye on, which of these behaviors are adaptive or maladaptive for each of us, and make sure that you're kind of reflecting on how you're doing with your self-care. And, we encourage, of course, engaging in those behaviors and activities that promote wellness for yourself. Okay, I think this is the last figure that I'll show from this comparison data here. This just shows a couple of areas or resources that trainees endorsed exploring for additional information, training, and support. And so a lot of students originally were seeking out information and support through professional organizations right away. That number dropped a little bit, but there's still a high number. Listservs and email groups are highly used, as are kind of peers and mentors. One finding that I thought was kind of interesting, we didn't ask this in the first survey, that's what the asterisk there notes, but there have been a lot of several resources that have become available for virtual or online learning didactic opportunities, and we're happy to see that a large number of trainees are seeking out those opportunities and engaging in them. So just a couple of more findings that I'd like to highlight here. In the original sample, 82% of trainees endorsed having adequate social support or perceiving that they have adequate social support. Unfortunately, that number declined a little bit in the follow-up survey, down to 60%. We talked earlier about work and life and personal responsibilities. A high number of individuals are having difficulty balancing the two, particularly while working from home. We talked too about overall there being a higher level of stress during the pandemic, with the vast majority of trainees experiencing a higher level of stress. But there appears to be some additional kind of differences based on kind of your ethno-racial identification, such that the trainees who identified as belonging to an ethno-racial minority group were more likely than white trainees to be worried about delays to their education and be more worried about potential negative impact on obtaining a job. They also were more likely to report greater financial loss and concerns about childcare. So it's important to keep in mind the potential disparities that are exacerbated by this. Women, more so than other gender identifications or identities, were reporting more stress for personal health and safety, as well as higher levels of anxiety, depression, and stress. So overall, I think it's important for us to ask our trainees how they're doing, and we wanted to survey the trainees at different levels to better hear the voice of trainees and how they're doing through the pandemic. Again, this is just a small set of the data that we gathered, and I encourage you to read the paper for more. But I think through this, we learned that we need to support one another and reach out to your peers and your mentors, and know that if you are experiencing some increased difficulty managing the stress and coping, that you're not alone, and there's others that are experiencing that too. And so make sure you're checking in for yourself, seeking out help when needed, and keeping in touch with your peers and mentors to help optimize coping. So in the second portion here of the talk, I want to talk about some tips and strategies. Focusing on the early career, I think there's some unique factors associated with one's early career. During this time, we're establishing our professional identity. We're transitioning from what it means to be a trainee, both in tasks and responsibilities, but also kind of that mindset too, and that now you're a provider and not a trainee, and Sometimes that includes a little bit of an imposter syndrome and kind of integrating that new professional identity is a process and takes time. In addition to changes in work roles and responsibilities, there's oftentimes a lot of personal changes that are occurring during this life stage. Many people are moving to a new location. Many are finding partners and spouses, getting married, having children. So kind of new chapters of their life in other aspects. And as with any stage, there's risk for isolation. A lot of trainees are moving into a new position in a new area. They're still getting to know their coworkers. Maybe they're in a new community and have yet to kind of find that community support. And so there's a risk there for feeling a degree of isolation. So, I encourage you to think about kind of broadly speaking, what has worked for you in the past? It's not a one size fits all. What may be a beneficial coping mechanism and strategy for one person may not fit for another person. So spend some time thinking about what has been beneficial for you in the past and think about how that might apply for how you're doing as you transition into this new chapter of your life. But be flexible in it. And we'll talk a little bit more here about some additional specific kind of strategies that you can engage in. So a lot of this information is pulled from a really great paper that Maya and her colleagues wrote looking at work-life integration in neuropsychology, and they offer a really nice review and then a number of really great recommendations. So I'm going to borrow some content from them to share with you here. So one thing they talk about doing is developing a plan. So spend some time early on to identify a career path for yourself. You don't have to have everything figured out. And in fact, you probably don't want to have everything figured out. You want to have a little bit of flexibility there. But by and large, have in mind kind of where you see yourself going. This includes in the short term, so immediate goals, kind of short-term, intermediate goals, and then long-term career goals. And one kind of metric here that you can use to help kind of operationalize these goals is the SMART system. And of course, like any good psychologist, we encourage you to write it down so you can reference it later. But this SMART system encourages you to be really specific with the goals that you have, identify measurable as much as you can, kind of tangible changes and kind of benchmarks for yourself so that when you're kind of progressing toward where you're heading. You want these goals to be achievable, right, and realistic, and you want them to be in a reasonable time frame. So this is kind of a maybe an outline of sorts that you can use to help shape what for you may be a reasonable career path and goals. And this applies to multiple domains, whether it's clinical, research, supervision, and elements of your life outside of your work as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit about expectations and boundaries. Boundary setting, it can be a challenging topic and difficult to establish appropriately. The good news, I think, for neuropsychologists, we tend to have a nice skill set that colleagues in and around the institution. I guess it depends on the work setting that you're in, but oftentimes neuropsychologists are asked to engage in different collaborations, whether they're academic pursuits, research, clinical committees. And so I think that speaks a lot to the skill set of a neuropsychologist, but there's that kind of risk of becoming overcommitted, and there may be some pressures to commit or to say yes to opportunities that come along. Some of those pressures may also be internal pressures too. So reflect on that, be mindful and aware of that. that, there may be this kind of drive to prove oneself that, I can do this, that I belong, that I'm ready to be an independent provider. And while that can be good to a certain degree, you want to make sure that it doesn't get to the point where it's maladaptive. So we encourage you to set very selective, be reasonable and appropriate expectations for yourself and your involvement in any kind of opportunity. Do that early on, both for yourself and for your collaborators. That provides a kind of a tangible framework then that you can use as an anchor point to assess for drift later. And if you do drift, kind of re-anchor yourself, kind of bring yourself back to. I think also a good kind of anchoring kind of check-in is to think about whether an opportunity that may come along, does it align with your career goals? So here we see that it's important to establish kind of that career path and immediate short-term and long-term goals so that you can use that as then a kind of a guiding post for you along the line as different opportunities come up. So if an opportunity seems to kind of fit with your goals and is something you're interested in, then you might want to engage in that. But sometimes you might need to say no. And I know I've had a lot of conversations with trainees about, in early career providers, myself included, how do you appropriately say no? And how do you do that in a reasonable and respectful way? And there's a couple of strategies that I would recommend to you, and some of these are pulled from that paper I referenced. First and foremost, it may seem simple, but don't answer right away. Almost all of the opportunities that may come across your plate don't require an immediate answer. You can usually have at least a little bit of time to think it through. So take that time you need to really think about this decision. And as needed, clarify, gather information to clarify what the expectations are, what are the demands of your time, of your resources, of your expertise that are needed, what resources may be available to you to support you through the experience and the opportunity. Do you have time to do it? And do you have time to do it well? Right? There's only so much time that we have in the day. And if you continue to add to-dos, then quality may suffer and you may not be able to give the time and energy to those things that you really enjoy because you've got so many other things that require some of your time too. And again, my favorite question, does it align with your goals? Really consider, what are my short-term, intermediate, and long-term goals? So discuss with your mentor, discuss with other individuals who you value their input on, helps to get perspective. And then when you've made a decision, it's okay to be assertive with the communication of your decision, even if it is a no, and you can do it in a responsible and respectful way. So in seeking out mentors and resources, there's so much you can discuss with mentors, including setting goals, how to be assertive if that's something that doesn't come naturally to you or would like to work on, additional strategies or practice in how to say no. And it's not a one size fits all sort of thing. So one person may not fill all of the mentorship roles that you need or are craving. So you may want to consider having multiple mentors. Probably don't want too many, but it may help to have somebody either in your immediate work group or division and out, or having somebody in, if you're serving in different roles, maybe have somebody in one role and in another role to provide some mentorship. If you're able to, try to seek out mentors that appear to be, living their career in a way that aligns with the career that you're seeking for yourself as well. And don't underestimate the power of peer support. Connect with other junior colleagues, whether it's in your division, outside of your division, and other specialty areas, or reconnect with fellows that you worked with before, or interns that you worked with before. Be a support for one another too. And please don't forget too that there's a number of national mentorship programs. You know, a lot of institutions now do have mentorship programs through like faculty development offices and that sort of thing. Some of this though is going to vary by the institution that you're working in. And so if your institution does not have a mentorship program, or you feel like the one that is offered isn't meeting your needs, please know that there's a number of national programs available too. Because this is a Student Affairs Committee talk, I'll give a shout out to the SAC mentorship program that is available for trainees. And you can find it on the website here. You just click on the link to complete a survey and we match you up with a mentor. And this is I just thought a really great table from this paper that I've been citing that lists out just so many different resources that are available. So I thank you for your time, and again, encourage you to read the TCN paper that came out, looking at the impact of COVID on the trainee experience, and hopefully soon we'll have a second follow-up paper. But I think a takeaway is to continue to reflect and do some check-in with how you're doing, and practice work-life integration, and engage in and use the support around you. And if you're finding that support is limited, check in with your faculty, with your supervisors, with your peers, and with your national organizations, because there's a lot of resources available now. So I thank you again for your time, and I believe we have one more talk that is in this pre-recorded session, and I look forward to hopefully having some good conversation and discussion in June during the live question and answer portion. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Honketter. I'm a member of AACN Student Affairs Committee and the chair of the Student Project Competition Subcommittee. 2021 marks the 6th year of our competition. This award recognizes outstanding student manuscripts that have been accepted by and published in the Clinical Neuropsychologist. The competition is open to all students and recent graduates who submit their first authored manuscripts based on their research projects. It's my honor to recognize the winners and the runners-up for both the 2020 and 2021 competitions, and to introduce those who are presenting their projects at our virtual student series this year. From the 2020 competition, we have a presentation from one of our 2 runners-up, Dr. David Shepard. His manuscript is titled "Prospective Memory Partially Mediates the Association Between Aging and Everyday Functioning." His manuscript is based on a project he completed at the University of Houston, where he examined the mediating role of prospective memory on age-related changes in everyday functioning. This project also has relevance to his ongoing research on fellowship, which aims to examine prospective memory performances and their association with everyday health behaviors in older veterans with PTSD. He's completing his neuropsychology research fellowship at the VA Puget Sound. He completed internship at the Seattle VA and his doctoral degree at the University of Houston. Dr. Shepard's career goals are to be board certified neuropsychologist, blending his clinical and research interests, which are focused on neurocognitive aging of various medical and psychiatric populations. For our 2021 competition, we have presentations from our winner and 2 runners-up. Our winner is Dr. David Mara with his manuscript titled "Validity of Teleneuropsychology for Older Adults in Response to COVID-19, a Systematic and Critical Review." Dr. Mara is a 2nd-year postdoctoral fellow at the University of Florida. He is currently involved in a research project that uses electronic medical record data to create an algorithm to predict the onset of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias 5 years before symptom onset.
In light of the COVID-19 pandemic, he has conducted research to document and facilitate changes in neuropsychological practice using or focusing on the utilization of telehealth services in order to ensure continued clinical care while maintaining the health and safety of vulnerable older adult populations. He is also working with a multidisciplinary team of neurologists, neuropsychologists, and bioinformatics specialists to investigate the neurologic effects of COVID-19 in a large multi-center database. The first of our runners-up is Crystal Guayar Quinn with her manuscript titled Re-Evaluation of Psychometric Evidence and Update of Normative Data for the Test of Practical Judgment. Crystal is a PhD student in the clinical psychology program at Queens College. She is completing research and clinical training in neuropsychology. Her research focuses on the expansion of this standardized measure of judgment that will make it more broadly applicable to patients of varying educational levels and socioeconomic status. Her work has been supported by the National Institute of Aging to help safeguard older adults from exploitation and abuse. Her future plans include continued research on improving the assessment of judgment ability in older adults, as well as pursuing board certification in clinical neuropsychology. Our next runner-up for the 2021 competition is Adriana Ratashka. Her manuscript is titled Cognitive Subtypes in Individuals with Essential Tremor Seeking Deep Brain Stimulation. Adriana is currently a second-year doctoral student at the University of Florida's Clinical Psychology program in the neuropsychology track. Her project is the result of her master's thesis. Adriana is interested in mood and cognition and the interface between the two in individuals with movement disorders. Upon completing her graduate education, she plans on pursuing a career integrating research and clinical work. One last. Please enjoy everyone's presentations and tune into our live Q&A session during the student series at AACN, where you'll have the opportunity to ask the students questions about their projects and presentations. Thank you.
Hello, my name is David Shepard, and I am a postdoctoral fellow at the VA Puget Sound, Seattle, and I'll be presenting a project that was recognized as a runner-up paper in the TCN Student Project Competition as part of work I did in graduate school at the University of Houston. This is a project that examines the potentially mediating role of prospective memory between older age and everyday functioning outcomes. I'd like to start with my acknowledgements. First, I'd like to thank the AACN and TCN for recognizing this project as a part of the TCN Student Project Competition. I'd also like to thank my current research mentor, Katie Pagulayan at the VA Puget Sound, who I currently work with doing similar work as this project, looking at prospective memory in aging veteran populations. I'd also like to thank my MyRec fellowship, including its director at the VA Puget Sound, Tracy Simpson. And of course, I'd like to thank my mentor from graduate school, Stephen Woods, with whom I wrote this current project, as well as my graduate student colleagues at the University of Houston. This project was supported by NIH grants. They're listed here. And I will note that the following content it includes my views and those of my co-authors and does not reflect position or policy of the VA or the US government. Now, even among healthy older adults, increasing age is associated with higher likelihood of having impairments in everyday functions, such as taking medications or managing finances. And while the reasons for increasing age resulting in everyday functioning difficulties are multifactorial, cognitive functioning has shown changes in older age and can affect adults' ability to carry out daily tasks. Now, among neurocognitive domains that change with older age, episodic memory and executive functions are commonly observed to decline, as shown here in the orange and pink lines, among other cognitive domains. Now, prospective memory, or PM, also defined as remembering to remember, is a cognitive function that relies on both retrospective memory and executive processing. And PM is itself affected in older age and is highly relevant to everyday tasks. It is defined as executing an intended action at a particular moment in the future, such as remembering to pick up your prescription while you're at the grocery store, or remembering to pay your rent at the first of the month. Now, these two examples are actually considered to represent two separate types of PM tasks. So in the grocery store example, the queue is an event. So you're at the grocery store, and that indicates that the intended task should be completed. We call these event-based tasks, and they are considered to be relatively more automatic and spontaneous. And in contrast, the other example of remembering to pay the rent at the first of the month, that's considered to be a time-based task, where the passage of time indicates that the action should be completed. And these tasks tend to be more reliant on strategic processing. Now, among healthy older adults, older age is associated with poorer prospective memory performances, and this can be at times more pronounced for strategically demanding time-based PM, as shown here, where the oldest cohort in this study demonstrated the most poor time-based PM performances. Now, prospective memory is critical for completing important everyday functioning behaviors, such as taking medications or handling finances. So for example, in this study of older adults, individuals who had difficulties performing ADLs were more likely to perform more poorly on time-based prospective memory relative to individuals without ADL difficulties. So if we put this all together, given that age is a predictor of everyday functioning, and since PM has been shown to decline with age, the current study sought to determine whether prospective memory performances mediate the association between age and everyday functioning. We predicted that both strategically demanding time-based PM and event-based PM would mediate the effect of age and manifest everyday functioning. And given that the literature pointing to the potential importance of time-based PM between age and everyday functioning, we hypothesized that time-based PM would have a stronger indirect mediating role, as indicated by a larger effect size compared to that of event-based PM. We also sought to examine the possible specificity of PM by determining whether traditional neuropsychological measures of executive functions and retrospective memory also would serve as mediators between age and everyday functioning. And here we predicted that both of these cognitive domains would have partially mediating roles, but not fully account for the association between age and everyday functioning. Now, our sample included a cross-sectional investigation of 468 individuals between the ages of 18 and 75. We used exclusion criteria typical for a cognitive study, such as excluding first strokes, seizures, and active neuropsychiatric conditions. Now, on average, our sample was in their mid-40s. They were mostly white men with slightly more than a high school education. And you can see here that by virtue of being a retrospective data analysis, this sample did have a high rate of different comorbidities, including HIV, substance dependence, and lifetime affective disorders, with half or more of the sample having at least one of those conditions. And I've listed here also some of the sample data for the prospective memory assessment and everyday functioning outcomes in case you want to pause and look at those more closely. But the way we measured those in the current study, we used the memory for intention screening test as a measure of PM, which asked participants to remember for time-based and for event-based trials, such as in 2 minutes, ask me what time the session ends, and when I show you a red pen, sign your name on this paper. And this is all while completing an ongoing distractor word search task. We created an everyday functioning composite measure as the study outcome variable. That ranged from 0 to 4, depending on how many of these measures listed here were deemed to be dependent for a participant. So for example, on the activities of daily living scale, if a participant indicated that 2 or more ADLs had declined from their best levels to current levels, that participant was deemed to be dependent for ADLs. And we did that for each measure using different cut points. So participants were assessed using the Karnofsky scale of performance status, which is a physician rating of overall functioning. We queried for employment status, and we administered the profile of mood states for self-reported cognitive symptoms. Now, for cognitive domains, we constructed an executive functions composite consisting of action fluency, digits backwards, Tower of London total moves, and trail making test part B. And for retrospective memory, we use the CVLT2 long delay free recall and logical memory 2 delayed recall. We also included a covariate, a comorbidity composite scale as a covariate, in which scores could range from 0 to 4, depending on whether a participant had any of these listed comorbidities here at the bottom. So hepatitis C, HIV, lifetime substance dependence, and lifetime affective disorder. Now, jumping into the results, just to note before we get too in-depth, all of these models that I'm about to present control for both education and that comorbidity index that I just presented. I didn't present them here on the slide for simplicity's sake, but just so you know, these are all controlling for education and number of comorbidities. And what we found is that whether the cue is based on the passage of time, such as performing a task after 2 minutes, or when we gave a salient event as a cue, such as when I show you something, you do something, both of these types of prospective memory play the role of partial mediators between age and everyday functioning. And as you can see here in both of these models, each of the direct effects between age and everyday functioning were significant. And that was even when accounting for prospective memory as a mediator. Now, when examining executive functions and retrospective memory as possible mediators, we found too that both played the role of partial mediators between age and everyday functioning. However, as you can see, the effect sizes for executive functions and retrospective memory were generally around half that of the PM mediators that were on the previous slide. And I'm showing here the indirect effects for PM mediators in orange for reference, but you can see that here the executive functions and retrospective memory are serving relatively weaker, but still significant partially mediating roles. Now, in summary, both time and event-based PM partially mediated the association between age and everyday functioning. We saw comparable effect sizes between time-based and event-based PM as mediators, and this was contrary to our expectations. We were expecting that time-based PM would be a stronger mediator than event-based PM. And a few thoughts about that. One is, the MIST, it uses event-based cues that are non-focal to the ongoing task. So therefore, they're not entirely automatic and spontaneous. They do have some strategic demands to them. And moreover, just in general, PM tasks lie on the strategically demanding end of the declarative memory continuum. So this really could just be a function of overall strategically demanding memory playing this mediating role, regardless of what cue type you're looking at. Of course, kind of the take-home message, like, what does this mean? What can we do with it? One thing that these findings potentially indicate is that, any therapeutic interventions looking to improve everyday functioning outcomes in older adults, they may think about targeting PM as a specific method for mitigating some of those age-related everyday functioning difficulties. So for example, there's a growing literature looking at strategies to improve PM performances. Those include things like implementation intentions, visualization, calendaring. And the question then is, can this then improve manifest everyday functioning outcomes in older adults? And so another finding was that executive functions and retrospective memory also partially mediated the relationship between age and everyday functioning impairments, although the effect sizes were somewhat weaker than those of PM mediators. Now, given that PM is thought to rely heavily on each of these cognitive domains, this may generally indicate that PM is greater than the sum of its parts, which has some support in the literature, with PM being a dissociable construct from retrospective memory and executive functions. But also just, in general, we're looking at an outcome of everyday functioning here in the current models. It's possible that PM is just itself a more ecologically relevant measure of cognition than is, our traditional measures of retrospective memory and executive functions. And so therefore, it could just be playing a relatively stronger mediating role because it's more closely relevant to those experienced in daily life as measured by our outcome here. Now, there are a few limitations I'd like to mention for the current study. One is that this is all within cross-sectional data, which, by using mediation analyses, it precludes us from making any temporal or causal inferences that we might otherwise be able to generate if we were using longitudinal data. Also, our sample included a group of individuals from across the lifespan, so from teenagers to older adults, and so future studies will want to replicate or otherwise just examine this design among older adults. And finally, another limitation is the high rate of comorbidities in this sample. With high rates of hepatitis C virus, HIV, and lifetime histories of mood and substance use disorders, there's really limited generalizability of these findings to healthier samples. And together, future studies should use longitudinal designs to examine the possible mediating role of PM on age-related changes in everyday functioning, And that's particularly for everyday functioning impairments that are more severe. So thinking about things like syndromic neurocognitive disorders and major neurocognitive disorders as outcomes. And to this end, future studies should also examine PM and everyday functioning outcomes in older adults within certain clinical populations. So, for example, is this mediating effect that we found stronger still in people with HIV or people living with HIV or hepatitis C virus? And I'd like to note that this manuscript was recently published in TCN in case you'd like to read it in depth. And I'll be available for the Q&A scheduled during the conference. But if in addition you'd like to discuss this project more, or if you have any questions, feel free to email me. We can either correspond over email, or I'm happy also to meet to discuss this project. So thank you so much for attending, and have a great conference.
Good morning or afternoon, depending on when you're watching this video presentation. My name is David Marin. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Florida. I'm very honored to be speaking to you today about a paper I wrote with some of my colleagues on the validity of teleneuropsychology for older adults in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, systematic and critical review. While I recognize it's usually convention to do acknowledgements at the end, I really wanted to start with my gratitude towards my co-authors, Drs. Kristen Hamlet, Dr. Bowers, and Dr. Bauer, who without them, this paper probably wouldn't have come together as well as it did. I also wanted to thank some of the graduate students at the University of Florida, Andrea and Nicole, who helped with article extraction and some of the other nuances with this paper, as well as some of the folks at the University of Florida Clinical and Health Psychology faculty. I also want to thank the AACN Selection Committee for this incredible honor, and to you, the viewer, who's watching this presentation and taking the time out of your busy day to do so. So thank you all very much. I have no disclosures or conflicts of interest. So I know it's hard to think back about the time before 2020, before lockdown and COVID and all of the other difficulties that we're facing day to day now. But prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, telehealth services were actually well established for diagnostic and interventional services. And it's been shown to be used effectively for the management and treatment of conditions like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease across different medical practices and providers. It was really useful for providing care to rural and underserved communities. And patients and caregivers generally liked it, and it had good feedback and support from them. However, teleneuropsychology itself was still in its nascent stages. For example, Dr. Catherine Zane conducted a survey study in which she asked respondents about their clinical practices back in February 2020 before lockdown, so the last time we were at an in-person conference. What she found was that as of February 2020, 88% of the respondents reported no teleneuropsychology service delivery. And on average, only about 0.3 patients were being seen with telehealth, which is mostly being done at rehab hospitals. Now that quickly changed as we started to go into lockdown, and a survey study conducted with my Midwest colleagues, we found that a majority of clinicians were using telehealth services in some capacity. Now, while 52% or more were using it for interviews or feedback, there were about 3% of respondents who were using it for full neuropsychological evaluations, whereas only 18% of respondents indicated that they had no intention of using teleneuropsychology in the future. We're actually conducting a follow-up study on this, and so we'll see how those numbers change in the future. So as we all went into lockdown and were concerned about how we can revitalize and continue service provision, there were a lot of obstacles before we could implement teleneuropsychology effectively. Some of the commonly voiced concerns were that teleneuropsychology offered limited hands-on testing. There's limited opportunities for behavioral observations. There's some concerns that older adults had less familiarity with these technological services. And of course, there was always the concern that insurances wouldn't reimburse for these services at all. In addition, there were some studies that showed that there were subtle performance differences between individuals who were tested face-to-face versus individuals who were tested in a teleneuropsychology modality. Although there were many other studies that showed no such performance differences. Now, Dr. Timothy Brearley in 2017 conducted the first systematic review, a quantitative meta-analysis examining the validity and performance differences between individuals who are tested face-to-face versus individuals who are tested through teleneuropsychology. His study included 12 research studies aggregated together with 497 total participants. What he found was that there was a small but non-significant effect size between the differences of teleneuropsychology and face-to-face. So this was a critical first step in establishing the validity of teleneuropsychology. And if research is standing on the shoulders of giants, then Dr. Brearley is certainly the giant of whom we stood on to conduct this particular study. So this study, the current study, originated from our necessity to establish and find specific cognitive tests that had validity in different diagnostic groups. But we realized that there wasn't such a resource available. And so we decided to do our own systematic review. So we used the same methodology as Dr. Timothy Brearley, essentially built on it. But rather than doing a quantitative analysis, examining the difference between face-to-face and teleneuropsychology, we decided to qualitatively assess the validity of each individual measure. Our hope was that this would provide a tool and resources to clinicians who are starting to integrate teleneuropsychology services into their clinical practice. We hope that this would serve as a nice guideline so that they could find tests with the most validity based on the diagnostic groups that they were concerned with. Following the same methodology as Dr. Brearley, we searched 3 internet databases, starting from January 1st, 2016, where he left off, and March 21st, 2020, looking for pertinent articles using the same exact search terms as he did. Our inclusion criteria was slightly different because we were focused more so on older adult assessments, whereas Dr. Brearley looked at assessments across the lifespan. However, the other inclusion-exclusion criteria were the same, mainly that it required a counterbalance crossover design. Studies were excluded if test-level data were not included, and participants that required a significant in-person assistance were also excluded, as well as studies that utilize proprietary software. What we did is we extracted 532 studies for us to review. And after initial review of the abstracts, we exclude 517. We also found 9 additional studies to review based on informal searches, leading us to a sample of 24 articles for us to review in full text. After reviewing the full text, we retained 7 articles for our systematic review. And then we combined that with 10 of the studies from Dr. Brearley's 2017 study that focused on older adults. Once we extracted these studies, we looked at the tests individually. We judged the subjective validity, or we judged the validity of each test as either having strong, moderate, or limited support based on the number of studies that were published with each given cognitive measure, the between study agreement that was reported, and the sample size and diagnostic characteristics of these studies. The result of our 19 studies had 935 participants. 44% of those were healthy controls. We had a really nice spread of diagnostic groups. So we had including movement disorders, individuals with stroke or cerebrovascular accident, psychiatric conditions, MCI or Alzheimer's disease, or a mixed sample. 10 of the studies were conducted in the United States, with other studies conducted in Italy, Australia, Korea, Japan, and Canada. Notably, there's a poor representation of racial and ethnic minorities, which I'm going to touch on in a little bit later. Our final paper had more tables than a WAIS-4 normative manual. But what we hoped was by being able to dig through these, clinicians would be able to identify specific tests that would be useful in their clinical practice. So an individual or a clinician would be able to look by cognitive domain, select a test, and then review the respective validity studies for that test and determine whether or not there was sufficient validity based on the diagnostic characteristics of the patient that they're testing, as well as some cultural and cultural considerations. So I'm not going to bore you by going through every single table. That would make for a very boring talk. So rather, I'll share this figure here, which outlines the respective validity evidence for each cognitive measure. As you can see, there's only a few studies with really strong support, validity support, mainly cognitive screeners, some language measures like the Boston Naming Test and letter fluency and the digit span total. Whereas most other studies had moderate or limited validity support. So as you can see from the figure before, there's limited validity evidence for certain cognitive domains, specifically executive functioning, processing speed, and intelligence. Notably, only few validity studies utilized in-home equipment. Most of these studies were done in a hybrid method, where the participant or the patient would come to either a satellite clinic or the specific clinic, and the test administrator would be in a different room. So more research needs to be done on the subsequent validity of in-home measures, as there's a lot more internal threats to validity, such as pets running around, people coming into the room, patients not being able to write down information, or maybe not even being able to capture the attention of the participant, which is or the patient, which is a notable concern in pediatric populations. From this review, it was unclear the mediating factors of disease severity and teleneuropsychology reliability. So for example, if a severe dementia, if the validity would break down in a severe dementia versus a mild cognitive impairment. Finally, I want to point out that no or limited validity evidence does not equate to invalidity. So most of the studies that were found to have limited support where it was because there was only 1 or 2 research studies with small sample sizes. So that doesn't mean, and not necessarily because of poor psychometric properties or poor validity evidence. So future research just needs to focus on these studies, these measures, as well as others, to garner more support. Another really important point that I wanted to raise was the significant underrepresentation of ethnic minorities within studies conducted in the United States. Most of the participants were either white or Native American, thanks to Dr. Cullum's work with the Choctaw Nation. What's really stands out is that the 935 participants included in the study, only 23 were Hispanic or of Latin origin, only 3 were Black, and there were 0 Asian Americans included in our studies. So I just want to pause and really highlight that again. So in the systematic review of all the studies published to date, up to 2020, only 23 of the included participants were Hispanic or Latino, 3 were Black, and 0 were Asian American, which is incredibly concerning and raises concerns about generalizability and equity across research and clinical services. As we know that COVID-19 differentially affected ethnic minorities, especially in the United States of America. And also, we know that ethnic minorities have not as much access to internet services and subsequently potentially teleneuropsychology services. So as we think about the AACN's Relevance 2050 initiative, and it brings to mind the fact that 60% of the American population will be considered untestable by 2050 due to outdated norms. This really highlights the importance of the critical need for equitable access and inclusion in research and clinical service provision. For better or for worse, teleneuropsychology will likely stay around in some capacity. So it's absolutely critical that we have great representation of across different ethnic minorities to make sure that they are included in these studies, in part and to ensure that there is equal validity across these different groups. I want to thank you all so much for your time and your attention. And again, thank you so much to my collaborators, colleagues, and AACN Selection Committee and users.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Crystal Quinn, and I'm a student at Queens College in the Clinical Psychology PhD program. And I'm going to talk about improving the assessment of practical judgment ability in older adults for the AACN annual conference in 2021. Judgment is an important aspect of executive functioning and critical to many aspects of real-world functioning. It overlaps with cognitive constructs such as everyday problem solving and decision-making, and it might be defined as the ability to appraise information relevant to a novel situation and formulate conclusions based on thoughtful consideration. Several executive function processes are essential to judgment, such as planning, recognizing one's goals, alternating between ideas, evaluating possible consequences, and inhibiting inappropriate responses. In addition, judgment also relies on various other cognitive abilities, such as memory, language, and social and emotional skills. The assessment of judgment is essential to the comprehensive evaluation of neuropsychological status in older adults, and it's particularly important for those at risk for dementia and cognitive decline. As a consequence of executive dysfunction, autonomy and decision-making abilities may be compromised. Older adults are often targeted by scammers, and over a 5-year period between 2013 and 2018, over 8,000 older adults reported scams across the United States, and this is likely an underestimate as many scams go unreported. In clinical settings, information derived from judgment evaluations may inform treatment planning by informing diagnoses and providing an objective understanding of functional competence. This is important because older adults might be unaware of their deficits and continue to engage in unsafe activities such as driving, managing finances, or managing medications. A survey completed by Rabin and colleagues in 2008, which interviewed 290 psychologists across the United States and Canada, revealed that most neuropsychologists, about 87%, often or always assess judgment when evaluating patients with dementia. Interestingly, 77% of responses range from not at all confident to only slightly confident in their ability to assess judgment. 87% of respondents perceived a need for additional and improved measures of judgment ability. Results also revealed that neuropsychologists tend to rely on popular measures of executive functioning as proxies for assessing judgment. And while these measures might be useful, they do not assess judgment specifically. The test of practical judgment was developed in response to a perceived need for a clinically useful measure of judgment ability. The measure evaluates judgment related to safety, medical, social, ethical, and financial issues. There's a 9-item and 15-item form that are currently utilized, and each response is rated 0, 1, 2, or 3 points, depending on the soundness of the response. Limitations of the original TOPJ include the uniform racial, ethnic, and educational background of participants used to validate the measure. And this implies a restricted range of SES in the normative group. Moreover, the normative ranges did not have age or education stratification. The original TOPJ already has good psychometric properties, including adequate internal consistency as compared to other measures of judgment, and as well as strong test-retest and inter-rater reliability, and convergent and divergent validity evidence. The test of practical judgment is currently utilized by over 200 professionals, mainly neuropsychologists. The TOPJ has been shown to distinguish diagnostic groups such as mild cognitive impairment and other dementias, and dementias such as Alzheimer's disease and BV-FTD. Preliminary ecological validity evidence has been shown in that the TOPJ moderately correlates with functional ability, and the TOPJ also correlates with gray matter density in prefrontal brain regions associated with judgment and executive functioning. So in our manuscript, we reevaluated the psychometric evidence of the top J using a larger and more demographically diverse sample of participants. Participants were recruited from two main sources: an existing longitudinal research study, the Einstein Aging Study at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and from the community, including the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, and Nassau County. Participants from the Einstein Aging Study were age 70 and older and varied of cognitive status. These participants were categorized as cognitively intact if they scored within the normal range on a brief cognition measure. Of those who consented, 88% received the top J during their in-person visit, and the remainder were administered the top J by phone. The distributions of top J performance for the 9-item and 15-item forms were similar between administration types, and means were within 1 standard deviation within the entire sample. Community participants were recruited from community centers, churches, and adult education programs. Interested participants were administered the MOCA to screen for intact cognitive status. Participants received either the original or alternate or basic version, the latter of which was designed for individuals who are illiterate or have low education. The distributions of top J performance were similar, and means were within 1 standard deviation between administered MOCA versions for those who received the MOCA. After data were collected, responses to the top J protocols and scoring guidelines were reviewed carefully. Original scoring criteria was based primarily on a short list of sample responses, occasionally mixed with general concepts. So therefore, we created general concepts for each point value and added both simple and complex example responses to facilitate ease of scoring. Scoring was also adjusted for several items. Adjusted scoring was based on the quality of a response and in consideration with published recommendations where appropriate, as well as the content area tapped by the question. A manual was also developed with comprehensive administration instructions and practice items with scoring explanations. So in the example here, we see that the item reads, "You read a report that the government will reduce monthly Social Security payments from $1,000 to $500 for a certain percentage of recipients. What would you do?" So for 3 points, the participant should reference finding out if he or she is affected. For 2 points, the participant can make a response that's a little bit vague, but references gathering more information. For 1 point, the participant may indicate that they would adjust their finances, but there is no reference of investigating the matter further. And for 0 points, the participant would give a vague response that doesn't find out more about whether or not they're affected and really doesn't take any active steps to prepare in a possible change of benefits. The total sample size included 348 participants, 293 from EAS and 55 from the community. Participants were of varied backgrounds, including age, race, ethnicity, SES, and education, as well as cognitive status. The mean age in the cognitively intact group was 79 about, and the mean level of education in the normative group, which is the cognitively intact group labeled here, was about 15. In the cognitively intact group, SES estimates included the entire range from lowest to highest based on the Hollingshead two-factor index of social position, which takes into account occupation and education. Of those in the cognitively impaired group, up to 13% of cases could meet dementia status based on the MOCA range for Alzheimer's disease, with the majority of cases falling in the MCI range. An independent samples t-test was conducted to determine if the diagnostic groups had significantly different levels of education, and a Mann-Whitley U-test was conducted to determine if the diagnostic groups had statistically significant different median ages. So there was a statistically significant difference in education between the two groups, but there was no difference for age. A chi-square test revealed no sex differences in proportions between the diagnostic groups. Due to sample size restrictions in the race ethnicity categorizations, we conducted a chi-square test between diagnostic groups and 2 race ethnicity groups, which were non-Hispanic white versus Black, African American, Hispanic, Asian, other. In the cognitively intact group, 69% were non-Hispanic white compared to 31% of other race ethnicity. In the cognitively impaired group, 32.6% were non-Hispanic white compared to 67.4% of other race ethnicity. And this difference of proportions was significant. Using confirmatory factor analysis with the entire sample combined, we fit the data to a single factor model using the original 9 items. The single factor model fit the data well, suggesting that the fit of the data to the hypothesized model was adequate. A non-significant chi-square test indicates that the implied theoretical model fits the sample data, and it's desirable when assessing model fit. In addition, other estimates also indicated good model fit. As we can see here, though, item 2 was quite weak in terms of the factor loading. We replaced the weakest item, item 2, in which the participant is asked for personal financial information over the phone, with the stronger item 13, in which the participant needs to make a medical decision concerning surgery versus medication. And we fit the data to a new single factor model, and this model fit the data well. So this form is now called Form A. And we can see that the factor loadings are stronger here than they were before. Confirmatory factor analysis was repeated for the 15-item form. We fit the data to a single factor model, including the original 15 items. The single factor model did not fit the data well, suggesting some lack of fit of the data to the hypothesized model. And this is generally consistent with original findings, which stated that the 9-item version is psychometrically stronger than the 15-item form. Inter-rater reliability was strong. For the 9-item, the mean difference between raters was 0.02, and for the 15-item, the means were the same. Moving forward, I will be showing 9-item results, but all findings were replicated and consistent with the 15-item form. Internal consistency was adequate compared to other measures of judgment. Internal consistency is often underestimated, though, for shorter measures. Some evidence of convergent and divergent validity evidence also emerged. We see here weak to moderate correlations emerging with phonemic letter fluency, letter number sequencing, and Tower test achievement, and weak non-significant correlations emerging between the geriatric depression scale and R-band's figure copy. After adjustment for education, ANCOVA revealed a statistically significant difference in mean TOPJ Form A scores between diagnostic groups. Post-hoc analysis showed that the total mean scores for the cognitively intact group were higher than the cognitively impaired group. We explored the association of age and education, and both were weakly correlated with TOPJ Form A performance. The association seemed a bit stronger with education, though. Investigation of sex differences in the cognitively intact group revealed that there was no significant effect for sex. We investigated differences between the non-Hispanic white race ethnicity group and the other race ethnicity group, including Black, African American, Hispanic, Asian, and other. And we showed that within the cognitively intact group, there were differences between groups. So the Mann-Whitley U-test revealed that TOPJ scores were significantly different. And although these differences were seen between the groups, we saw that the means and the medians were still within one standard deviation, and the distributions of the scores were very similar between groups. Also, it's important to note that race ethnicity classifications are a proxy for other variables of interest that affect cognition and test performance, such as cultural factors, including quality of education and acculturation, as well as behavior, attitudes, and experiences. It's also important to remember that there's heterogeneity in one cultural group, within a cultural group. So as a scientific community, researchers are developing improved measures to capture these relevant variables, and these aspects were really not fully addressed in these studies and are considered a limitation of interpretation. Based on our findings, we decided to stratify norms based on education. We created 3 education groups, less than or equal to 12 years, 13 to 16 years, and 17 or greater years. We saw that there was a statistically significant difference between the lowest and the highest group, but not between all groups. So then we regrouped education to be less than or equal to 13 years or 14 or more years of education. And there was a statistically significant difference between these 2 groups. We created norms with percentile ranks because there was a significant skew of scores, which was consistent with the original TOPJ scores, indicating that scores were usually more positive towards the higher end of the scale. So of note, when skewness occurs in a distribution, the mean and the median differ because the mean is not the midpoint in rank. So when the sample distributions are non-normal, rank-based percentile scores are usually more appropriate for interpretation as compared to linearly transformed standard scores, such as z-scores, t-scores, and scaled scores, etc. Non-normality is an important issue to be addressed, but often is overlooked by test developers. So we ended up with a normative group consisting of 261 participants, which is an improvement from the original 39 in the original study. Again, the mean age was about 79, age ranged from 60 to 94. Mean education was about 15 and ranged from 6 years of education to 21 years of education. 69% of the normative group were female, and SES estimates ranged from the highest to the lowest possible based on occupation and education. And we improved representation of diverse racial ethnic backgrounds from 0% to 31%. Major benefits of the TOPJ include the improved sample size of the norms. We also developed complementary informant and alternate forms, although this was not discussed in this particular manuscript. Assessment of cognitive status for inclusion in the normative group is considered a strength because not all measures screen for cognitive status when including participants in a normative group. The calculation and spread of SES estimates within the normative group is also considered a benefit of the TOPJ in that it includes low to high estimates of SES. We also improved representation of race ethnicities other than non-Hispanic white in the normative group. And the TOPJ presents complex everyday situations that are written at a low educational level, 4th to 5th grade reading level. And also the TOPJ has ongoing reliability and validity evidence based on multiple studies, and this is very important. Limitations include the diagnostic accuracy of cognitive status, since we used a brief cognitive screen for inclusion in the normative group. However, again, as mentioned before, many measures do not screen for cognitive status at all when including participants in the normative group. Available measures for convergent divergent validity evidence were based on what was available in the longitudinal study and the existing battery. So we were unable to select the measures that we wanted. We would have chosen measures that are more closely related to judgment, such as decision making or problem solving. In addition, the participants used to develop the TOPJ were primarily of non-Hispanic white background, and although we improved the normative group, this is still considered a limitation. There is an ongoing need to recruit participants of diverse racial ethnic groups such as Hispanic and Asian groups as well. And we do require evidence that the TOPJ Form A continues to differentiate MCI versus dementia conditions. Future directions include investigating judgment in various dementia groups, confirming differences between cognitively intact versus MCI versus dementia, identifying a cut score for the measure, translating all measures, and this has already started in Spanish, assessing the relationship of constructs such as decision-making ability and judgment, assessing the incremental validity evidence of the TOPJ above and beyond other measures for assessing diagnoses or capacity, looking at neuroanatomical correlates, investigating test bias, and continuing to recruit norm group participants from lower educational levels and from other diverse groups such as Hispanic and Asian groups. All right, thank you so much for your time.
my name is Adriana Ratajska, and the title of my paper was Cognitive Subtypes in Individuals with Essential Tremor Seeking Deep Brain Stimulation. So just to give a bit of background on essential tremor, it's the most common tremor disorder in the world. There's over 7 million people living with the disorder in the United States alone. It's actually 10 times more common than Parkinson's disease. And it really varies from person to person in terms of when you develop it, how severe your symptoms are, and how your disease progresses. So to highlight some of the differences between essential tremor and Parkinson's disease, which most people are more familiar with. So they're both tremor disorders, but the type of tremor differs. So in essential tremor, you have an action tremor. So you see it when performing actions such as reaching out to get a glass of water. And then in Parkinson's disease, you see a tremor at rest. And in essential tremor, tremor is the primary motor symptom, whereas Parkinson's, you see additional motor symptoms. The onset age also varies between the two. So there's typically a bimodal age of onset in essential tremor. So typically adolescence or young adulthood and then older adulthood, whereas Parkinson's disease primarily occurs in older adulthood. The treatment approaches are also different between the two disorders. I just wanted to play a quick clip just to give you an idea of how much this tremor can manifest in daily life.
For people with severe tremors, eating a bowl of cereal can be a daunting task. Shireen Bala has a condition known as essential tremor that causes uncontrollable shaking whenever she uses her hands.
It is very embarrassing, and especially in public, at the restaurant.
But Bala can now eat with more.
So you can see how much this can have an impact on daily activities. So what's interesting about essential tremor is traditionally it was considered a benign disease, with tremor thought to be the main symptom that occurs. But in the past 2 decades, research has shown that additional cognitive changes occur. So the cognitive changes are typically described as frontal executive, so difficulties with cognitive inhibition, set shifting, verbal fluency, working memory. And these changes are thought to be due to pathology in the cerebellum, so cell loss in the cerebellum and Purkinje cell abnormalities, leading to disruption of circuitry going to the cortex. So these are just illustrations of these cerebrocerebellar pathways, the ascending tract from the cerebellum via thalamus to cerebral cortex, and then the descending tract via pontine nuclei to the cerebellum. So it's this ascending tract that's implicated in cognition, so the cerebellothalamocortical pathway. But this is just a proposed hypothesis for the cognitive changes. So it's also important to note, so the changes in essential tremor, the cognitive changes are thought to be mostly mild, but there is also a 60% increased risk for dementia in older adults with essential tremor, according to epidemiological studies. In addition to the changes in executive functioning, a number of studies have found deficits in areas ranging from language, memory, visuospatial skill. And so this study by Sersansky and colleagues inspired the current project. So their goal was to identify early cognitive patterns in essential tremor that may predict later decline. So they looked at essential tremor patients who did not have MCI or dementia to see if there are subtle differences in early signs of decline that may predict dementia in the future. So they did a cluster analysis of neuropsych data, and they found 3 clusters, so a relatively low memory cluster, relatively low attention, and then a high performing cluster. So I wanted to do a follow-up on Sersansky's study, which was the first ever cluster analysis of cognition in essential tremor. The goal of our study was to examine cognitive subgroups of essential tremor deep brain stimulation surgery candidates. So there's a few key differences between our study and Sersansky's. So first, we were looking to see if similar cognitive subtypes would be seen in DBS candidates. DBS is a common surgical procedure to reduce the severity of tremor in ET, and we selected DBS candidates because they typically have a greater disease burden. Our study also used a clinic referred sample rather than a community sample like Swersansky and colleagues did. So we were interested in seeing if there were similar cognitive subtypes in a more progressed cohort who likely had greater cognitive burden than the non-impaired sample Swersansky looked at. So I did a cluster analysis on baseline cognitive data from pre-surgical evaluation for deep brain stimulation using the neuropsych data that came from that. So I had 3 primary aims in my study. My first aim was, are there distinct cognitive subtypes in essential tremor patients who are candidates for DBS? Do cognitive subtypes differ in demographic and clinical factors? And what is the proportion of essential tremor patients who meet criteria for mild cognitive impairment, both in the derived subtypes and the overall sample? My sample consisted of 201 candidates for DBS with essential tremor. Our sample was about 69 years old, mostly male and Caucasian, highly educated, and had tremor duration of about 26 years, but you can see this varied a lot. And we excluded individuals who had dementia rating scale 2 scores below 125, and also excluded those with neurological comorbidities or those who have had DBS in the past. For my measures, so we use Z-score composites. We use Z-transform test scores and used an average of those tests for each of the 5 cognitive domains. I looked at memory, executive function, visuospatial skill, language, and processing speed. And then I also had additional measures which were not in the cluster analysis, but which I used to compare the clusters on. My statistical approach was to do a k-means cluster analysis, and I validated this with hierarchical clustering using Ward's method with squared Euclidean distance, and looked at the agreement between both. Turning to my results. So for my first aim, looking at cognitive subtypes in essential tremor, I found that a 3-cluster solution best captured differences between the groups. So in this plot, on the y-axis, you see the z-score. On the x-axis are the 3 different cluster groups, and the legend at the bottom shows what domain each bar is. So my first group there, I called the low executive group. This group had below 1 standard deviation on executive and processing speed score, so sort of the more typical essential tremor profile that I was expecting to see. Next group I called low memory multi-domain. This group had particularly low memory scores, so they scored below 1.7 standard deviations in the memory domain, and they had below 0.7 standard deviations on executive, processing speed, and language domains. So more of a sort of global dysfunction in this group, and in particular that low memory. Then finally, I had a cognitively normal group in my sample. This group had average performance throughout and also was the largest group in the study. I validated this with hierarchical clustering and found a highly similar 3-cluster solution with 93% agreement between both techniques. For my second aim, I was looking at differences between clusters. So I used Kruskal-Wallis and chi-square tests due to non-normality with Bonferroni corrections. So first I found for age, the cognitively normal cluster was actually interestingly older than the low memory cluster. And the cognitively normal cluster also had more years of education than both the low executive and low memory clusters. There were no differences between the clusters and other demographic factors or tremor severity or duration. I also looked at differences in mood and dementia rating scale 2 score. I found that for anxiety, the low memory cluster had more situational anxiety than the cognitively normal cluster. And I also found that for the DRS, the low executive and low memory groups both had lower DRS-2 scores, indicating lower global cognition. I didn't find any differences on other mood measures. For my third aim, I was looking at mild cognitive impairment in the sample. So how I operationalized MCI was a Z-score composite below 1.5 standard deviations in at least 1 domain. So if you had a Z-score as your composite average below 1.5, you were classified as MCI. And I tried a range of 1 to 2 standard deviations, which is the Movement Disorder Society criteria for MCI, between settling on 1.5, which I found to be a good middle ground. I also broke it down further into amnestic and non-amnestic based on if the memory domain was impaired, and also single versus multiple domain impairment. So looking at the pie chart, the overall sample was mostly normal. 73% did not meet criteria for MCI. And then out of the MCI cases, non-amnestic, so those orange and yellow slices there, was more common than amnestic, the light blue and green slices. Single domain was also more common than multi-domain impairment. I also examined how MCI mapped onto our cluster groups, and it matched up pretty well. So on the left there, I have the cognitively normal cluster. That group was mostly classified as non-MCI. Then in the middle, the low executive cluster had a larger proportion that was classified as MCI. And then finally, the low memory multi-domain cluster, the cluster that had a more global degree of impairment, was mostly classified as MCI. So overall, I found these 3 clusters in essential tremor patients based on their cognitive data. So the low executive cluster is the more typical essential tremor profile I was expecting to see in the data. The low memory multi-domain cluster had a greater degree of impairment beyond just executive domains we would expect in essential tremor. Notably, this group had low memory scores. So it's possible that this group is an at-risk group for age-related disorders such as Alzheimer's or other dementias. This group was also more anxious than the other 2 groups. Then I had the cognitively normal cluster. This group did not show signs of cognitive decline. Most likely this is because cognitive decline doesn't occur in everyone with essential tremor, but it's also possible that this group had a higher degree of cognitive reserve, which could be related to the higher level of education in this cluster. Our findings were similar to the Sierczewski study, but we couldn't compare them directly due to differences in neuropsychological measures. Overall, our composite scores were lower in this study, though, which would be expected since they used a cognitively intact sample. And this study is also a first step in examining baseline cognitive profiles in essential tremor DBS candidates. So the research on the effects of DBS on cognition in ET is somewhat limited, so this adds in at least providing more information on the baseline functioning. So for my second aim, looking at between cluster comparisons. So interestingly, I found that the cognitively normal cluster was older. We were not totally sure why this would be, but that group also had higher education, which may be related to why they performed better. And then the low memory multi-domain cluster also had higher state anxiety, which could have impacted their scores. And they also had lower dementia rating scale 2 scores, so lower overall cognition. And then for mild cognitive impairment, I found that 27% of the sample met criteria for MCI. Of those with MCI, the non-amnestic subtype was more common than the amnestic subtype. And the cognitively low clusters, so the low memory and low executive clusters, had higher proportions of MCI. So turning to limitations and future directions. So this was a cross-sectional, demographically limited sample. Future research should look at a larger sample and look longitudinally, particularly at post-surgical outcomes in DBS, as well as transition to dementia. So for example, does the low memory multi-domain group have worse outcomes after DBS, and are they more likely to transition to dementia? I also did not have data on medication usage, so it's possible that there's side effects of medications like propranolol or primidone, which could have contributed to the cognitive disturbances and cognitive profiles that we found. And then finally, in this study, I did not look at neuroimaging data. I'm actually looking at that data right now. So a subset of my sample ended up going on to have deep brain stimulation and had a pre-surgical MRI. So the question I'm interested in looking at is, does cerebellar compromise explain impairments, or are there concomitant neurodegenerative processes, at least in at least some of the clusters? So I'll compare the data between clusters. For example, it could be that there's more of a mesial temporal lobe dysfunction in the low memory group. I'm so excited to look at that data. And with that, I just wanted to make a few acknowledgements. I'd like to thank Dr. Dawn Bowers, my mentor, movement disorders, T32, that I'm an associate trainee on, the University of Florida Norman Fixel Institute for Neurological Diseases, and the University of Florida Cognitive Neuroscience Lab. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you for listening.